welcome to the next lecture in the ARIVE XR lecture series. I have the great pleasure to give that one on presence. This is what you probably always wanted to know about presence, but never dared to ask, so you will learn that today. Wait, I have to click that here, probably doesn't work. Yeah. So I will do a quick recap on virtual reality, but very quickly, just to define our terms a little bit. And then I will go into that question: what is the difference between immersion and presence? And that that confuses many people. And so I hope you, after that lecture, you will be less confused. Then I will talk about how we measure presence. And we'll talk about what does presence mean with more than one person is in a virtual environment. And if time allows for it, I will also go into the topics a little bit of telepresence and in terms of what is presence, what does presence mean for mixed reality environments. That's okay. So as a note, so there are different schools of thought here, right? So what are the concepts of presence and so on and so forth. So I present our views on what we think is the right concept, right? So please listen, and I will have some questions in between for some of the audience. Yes. Okay, let's start with virtual reality. So actually it has two main views. So one is more conceptual view, right? So and that could be, presence in terms of I feel, present in that story or that movie, or I'm daydreaming, or I'm taking drugs or whatever. And that brings me into a different state of presence, right? So it's one view. The second view is more a technological view, which is we are using some kind of XR technology, and we are having a sense of being there. So I'm focusing on the technology aspect more, even if it has some conceptual aspects, as you will see in a second. So it's a technology focus because we are technologists. So we look at virtual reality from that kind of perspective, right? Virtual reality as technology. Okay. So a little bit of a recap. So Alex introduced that. So what is actually virtual reality? Virtual reality is, from a technology point of view, it's a computer-generated environment. Somehow it's computer-generated. It is three-dimensional, so we can still discuss what three-dimensional means, whether it's stereoscopic imagery or whether it's 3D modeling or what does it mean. It is interactive with real time, so you get interactive real-time feedback while you're engaging with that kind of virtual environment. And now the fourth component is the sense of presence. So actually we do that with the aim that the users feel that they are part of that virtual environment, and we call that sense of presence. So it's a defining element of virtual reality, right? And so if we extend that whole concept towards mixing real and virtual, towards augmented reality, then what we do is we add a real environment to our virtual environment. Somehow we spatially align correctly the virtual content into the real environment. And the aim here is to give the impression that this is forming one coherent environment. So we give the impression that we experience one environment, right? So that's just a recap for virtual reality. So, and we start immediately with some questions in the room. So let's imagine you're sitting in the high-res, movie theater, and you're watching Avatar or something like that with your stereoscopic glasses. Is that virtual reality? Yes, no, perhaps. As first people in the room. Yep. So there was a yeah. Can you perhaps justify your answer?
Yeah. Computer-generated imagery. It's 3D, and if it's good enough, you probably have the sense of presence.
Okay. Any different viewpoints in the room?
I don't know if you have a sense of presence, because when I was watching Avatar, I didn't think I was on the world that they were on.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So there was a yes, yeah, probably, and you would feel that you already felt even in that movie that you were part of the scene, and and you did not. So, any other? We have one VR yes, one VR no.
I think no as well, because you can't exactly interact with it. It's a set thing you're watching, and you can't actually influence what happens.
So I would very much agree with Benjamin here in the room. So whether you feel present in that scene, that's actually probably dependent on different factors. But certainly there's one thing for certain from a technology point of view, we can't interact really with that scene, right? So the viewpoint is set by the director or the cameraman. And so we are sitting in that sweet spot where we see that scene. We can't, interrupt, the plot or whatever. So I would also say this is, in my definition, not virtual reality because it's not interactive, right? Or not interactive in that way. Okay. So another example. You're not off the hook yet. So let's say you have some virtual reality scene, experience with a head-mounted display. VR, yes, no, perhaps. Yeah, there was an yeah, good. Yeah.
I mean, you can live without in your own sort of world.
And it's computer generated, probably. Yeah, yeah. It's all good. So there was a yes. Any, different opinions? Yeah. Okay, I will go to the third one. Step one, it's actually an application. It's a virtual reality application, which is actually about the overcoming the fear of public speaking or social phobias. So you see on the left-hand side, you see that person wearing a head-mounted display, and then you see the scene with those avatars in the room watching you. As a user, VR, yes, no, perhaps? Yes? Yeah, yeah, okay. Yes, VR, depending on how convincing the graphics is, yeah. Yeah. So I would say, I would give it a yes, not because of the reason why, how convincing the graphics is. It is probably more when I see that person standing there and I see the response that looks really like that person is really in that world. Right? Even if the graphics is not that great, actually, by the way. But I would also consider as VR because we observe real world behavior while using the virtual environment, right? So that would be my take. So, but the main point is here. So also from a technological point of view, VR is at the presence is at the heart of VR of that concept, right? It's really, this is the defining thing. So we can produce different. Tobias is grinning about the photo. VR is actually, we can produce interactive computer graphics environments for lots of purposes, for wow effects, for enjoyment, for all kinds of emotional arousal, whatever it is. But virtual reality is actually about that I have the sense of being there. So it's the very definition of virtual reality. Okay, so let's go now to the immersion versus and presence issue. So the big confusion about that comes actually because our discipline, we technologists borrowed that word immersion from the literature science, right? So in literature, you say, I feel immersed, in that plot or that book or that story or whatever. And so we actually abused that term and said, no, we redefined that, right? And actually that kind of immersion in the thing we call presence. So that's why, let's go look into a little bit of my own history. So Holger's wrong assumption. I think that's also in some of your heads is, okay, in the end, perhaps we can have a formula, a long formula, which describes immersion equals to, and then we have some sort of weighted, factors which play into it. Let's say, if I have a high resolution and a low latency and a certain degree of interactivity and so on and so forth, and a certain display type, I will have 0.756 degree of immersion, right? And so this was my starting point. So I thought, okay, then I will find out, what is that immersion thing, right? But actually, it is a little bit more complex. I mean, Jonathan Sturr thought on the same lines as me, because he says, okay, we have that vividness and interactivity factors, and we can even break them down into other quantifiable factors. But what he already where he made the difference is already, okay, we've got the technology, and the other one is actually the human experience. Perhaps there's even more to it than just, the highest resolution will give me the highest sense of being there, or the lowest latency will give me that. Probably it's a little bit more complicated than that, even if he draws those two arrows towards, what he calls telepresence, which is, synonymous with presence in those days, right? So there's another view, and so even if I don't like the cheesy graphics, but I'm more subscribed to that model, which was developed by Wieland Isselstein and Giuseppe Riva. It is more like, so what presence is actually what is happening in our head, right? It's part of that whole perception, feeling, cognition system which we experience. It's the experience side of things. And the immersion side of things is more on that technology side. So we have a system over there, and that system over there provides us with some sort of story or plot or environment. And part of that is actually all these immersive factors. And then we perceive that and we interact with that environment, and that leads to that loop where we either develop or don't develop that sense of presence in it, right? So it's quite complex, right? Mel Slater, which is actually one of the figures, so if you have to remember some names, these are the names you should remember when it comes to presence research actually in virtual environments. So Mel Slater, he says, okay, actually it's two things we need for presence. So one is the place illusion, that's what we would probably call spatial presence. We think that we are, our body parts are part of that kind of environment, right? And then there's a second aspect to it, which he would call the plausibility illusion. So is it plausible what is happening, right? In the real world, we don't really ask that question, right? We think, oh yeah, there's gravity and there's light and there's air and whatever. So it seems to be coherent and plausible that we are here and that it's not an illusion, right? But in virtual reality, we can't be sure about that, right? So we have to provide an environment which is somehow plausible. So he says, you know, that kind of presence, placement, place illusion and the plausibility illusion, right? But of course, you know, Holger was always knowing it better even before him. So I broke that down actually in the modeling aspect and said, okay, there are a couple of factors which contribute to that construct, and there are a couple of things which are a result of that, right? So one I would call quality of immersion, and it's exactly those fidelity factors which are in it, right? So what's the fidelity of the technical system, right? The second one I call drama, which is actually a little bit dramatic. What it really means is actually, is there a plot? Is there a story in the world? What does the environment tell me? And why I called it drama was probably influenced by an early pioneering book by Brenda Laurel, which was called Computers as Theaters. And so she looked at the virtual environment as a dramatic installation, right? The third aspect is interface awareness, and that means rather the opposite. So is the interface in the way to the true experience of the virtual environment, right? So do we still see the interface or do we see the world in it, right? And so it's also called the disappearing interface or the transparent interface and so forth. Fourth factor is exploration. So are we able to explore that world? So Stoya would probably call it interactivity or the vividness of the interactivity, right? So can we really look around for ourselves? Can we, you know, interrupt the plot and so on and so forth? And the fifth one is actually what I call predictability. This is more what means the plausibility of the whole thing. So is it really, would I expect if I drop something here that it drops also in the virtual environment? Is it a predictable, is it a plausible environment? So when you measure those things with users on the user experience side, you will come to three main factors, and that is confirmed. So one is the spatial presence we talked about. It's the place illusion with Slater. So are we part of that environment? The second biggest one is involvement. So do I feel involved, engaged in that environment? So it's really a psychological factor. And the third one is the perceived realism. And that's actually the lowest of the three, right? So when you measure that, and we measure that in a lot of studies, so the perceived realism is actually, it's a low loading factor onto the presence construct. And I will explain that with that one example. This is a study where the environment is apparently low res. I mean, it's not really a lot of, triangles. It's not very super textured. It actually has one light in it, and the rest is fake. But what it does, and now comes the plausibility illusion element of it, so it has some animated parts in it, and because during that time it was impossible to render full body avatars, that was just shoes walking around in an environment and doors opening and closing. So you get the impression that there's something going on that office floor. So, but why I show that is for two reasons. So one is that you don't need the highest realism to experience presence in an environment. So even if that would be the highest possible resolution, it would not add to the presence experience. And the second is that it also has to do with the predictability of the environment, because in that particular study, we ran two groups, and one group was told that you are interacting with that world like a ghost. So the environment is not taking any notice of you. you're transparent, right, to the actors in that environment. And the other group was told that, you know, the way you walk through that environment, that will influence, you know, which people come out of which doors and interact with you in some way. So interestingly enough, the ones who thought that they interact with the environment showed higher levels of presence than the ones who were told they are just a ghost. So you see, it has, even that has an influence. So your mindset, how you go into that world, and probably you all know that from gaming, what the story is about, how you feel present in that world, right? Okay, so now coming to the essence of it. So what is actually the difference between the immersion and the presence things, right? So if we want to control for immersion, and that does not necessarily mean that it leads to a higher sense of presence, but perhaps it influences, or it has a certain threshold for your particular application. So we can control the display type, for instance. That means we are using a head-mounted display, or we're using a projection system, or even, you know, a cave system or whatever, right? So it has to do with resolution, with field of view, and all these factors which, you know, Holger thought in the 90s, these are leading directly to that kind of sense of being there. So how do we, so that's the control of it. How do we measure those components? The one is by their units, right? So is the field of view really the field of view we are measuring, or we get it from specifications? Especially field of view is often a thing which we have to measure afterwards because everyone defines it differently. But also not only the fidelity in terms of dots per inch or points per inch, but what is the perceived fidelity? So how do the users perceive the fidelity? It doesn't mean that they perceive the presence. It is perceiving the fidelity. Or do they perceive the jitter in the visualization, for instance? Or is it just the jitter is there, but nobody really notices, and so on and so forth? These are all immersion factors. They don't necessarily mean that this is presence. It is some sort of immersion quality, right? When we come now to presence, it's the same thing. So how do we control presence, and how can we measure presence, right? So control by immersion factors, see last slide. And or what is actually the plot, what is the drama, what are we presenting, what kind of story is told in the virtual environment, the way we interact with it, the coherence in the world, which is even more so in mixed reality environments. We hopefully come to that later, or the way how we influence the suspension of disbelief. So we all know when we enter a virtual environment, this is not real. This is just, it's a fake environment. That's what it's a virtual reality, right? But like in a movie, we want to suspend that disbelief, right? So how can we influence that, right? And the measures are normally fallen into three categories, and I come to that in the next part is, so either they're subjectively reported, right? I asked, no, do you feel present in the environment? And he would say yes or no, or perhaps, or whatever. You observed ones, so we see no, you know, acting in that environment, or the measured ones, you know, we equip him with some equipment and we try to measure things. So I will go into the things in the next part. But now for you as a take-home message, I just simplified that brutally, what the difference between immersion and presence is. So the immersion is actually the fidelity of the technical surroundedness. So it's a technical aspect, right? So the fidelity of that is the immersion, and presence is the sense of being there. So one is the experience thing, the other one is the technology thing, right? It's simplified, it is more complex than that, but I think that makes it more clear what the difference is between immersion and presence. Okay, got that? I see some nodding in the room, so that's reassuring. Okay, now, if presence is at the heart of it all, how do we measure it? How do we measure that we have successfully produced a virtual reality system application experience, right? So there are normally three different ways of measuring it. So either self-report, which can be questionnaires, which is the predominant mode of measuring presence, or you can also have interviews or focus groups or other forms of subjective self-report. I will focus on questionnaires here. Second one is observation, right? So observation means normally you have some raters, some observers, and those observers get a list of some codes to observe. You know, do you see any behavior, whatever, X, Y, Z, and then they note that down. Or you do that on video recordings, and then you do that later as an analysis. And the third group is actually this, what we normally, as you know, technology scientists like most, is some sort of objective measures, right? So eye tracking, galvanic skin response, which is the resistance of the skin, right? If you're more sweaty, right, probably we measure that, or the heart rate variability, or the pulse, or whatever it is. So this is the physiological measure. So I will bring examples for all three of them now in the next couple of slides, right? And there will be more questions. Yeah, you're not off the hook yet. So presence measures in terms of self-report. The questionnaire, as I said, is the predominant mode of measuring presence. And there are lots and lots and lots of questionnaires. I just, put 4 here on this slide. But fortunately, and it's a little bit of advertising here, there was a recent Kai paper which analyzed actually the most well-known or most used questionnaires on presence, and tried to find out which ones are the most applicable and really measuring the concept of presence. And they started with the very early first measures by Woodrow Barfield and Suzanne Weghorst in the mid-90s. And they did that until the early 2000s, when that was quite an established field of research and application. And you see already on the right-hand side the number of items, and that is actually a crucial part, and I come to that in a sec. So how long does it take to fill in a questionnaire to answer the question of presence? And can you really ask your users to do that, and how laborious is that, and so on and so forth, right? So fortunately, those guys from the Kai paper from 2019, they came to the conclusion that the ARIVE presence questionnaire, which I had the pleasure to work on in the past, is actually the one you should use for 2 main reasons. So one is, it's from their study, from their investigations, it is probably the best measure of the construct of presence, and you have to read the paper why that is the case. And the second one is really that practical aspect, right? So what is a practical size of a questionnaire? So is it 100 questions, or is it 1 question, right, as extreme cases? And so that one with 14 questions is probably exactly at that Goldilocks space, where you say, oh yeah, that, it will take me only a couple of minutes at most to answer it, but it's in itself, it has enough components that we really measure something, right? Instead of just one question, right? So let's talk about questionnaires. Yeah, that's the question now. What are the limitations, right? So we are applying those questionnaires to measure the sense of presence. What are possible limitations?
The understanding of the person from that questionnaire, if they know what presence is or not.
Oh, yeah. What is that thing, right? Yeah. What are you asking me? Yeah. So do they first have to watch the lecture before they are able to answer the question? Yeah. Okay. What else?
Emotions can be quite difficult to convey in words.
Very good point, right? So what is it really? It's a feeling, right? And in the extreme case, you need the arts or something like that to really express that. And now you should do it in words. Yeah, that's a flaw. Yeah, definitely. People can lie. Yeah, if they want to. Yeah, they can, or they want to just to please you, right? And they know, oh, you are Benjamin, the experimenter, and you need that really for your master's thesis. Yeah, I will give you the highest ratings, right? Yeah.
So the time delay between the and the experience in the.
Oh, it's always retrospectively, right? So after you have to think back. Oh, was it actually my experience? Was it? Yeah, and then you have to report on it, right? Yeah, very good points. I mean, so this is really, these I think these are the main points. Are they? Yes. No, there's one more. It's the normally questionnaires, they use those Likert scales, right? From 1 to 7 or 1 to 5 or whatever, strongly agree, strongly disagree. And there's actually, when you talk to empirical statisticians, for instance, they would say, oh, don't use Likert scales. They're so flawed for a number of reasons, and I could explain them now, but we don't have time for it. So it's an inherent flaw in the questionnaire. So it's not ideal, right? It's not ideal to use those questionnaires. Probably that's the take-home message. Okay, let's move on. And that's actually, Mel Slater actually came up with that, or he promoted that and said, oh, okay, let's actually have a look how people react in virtual environments in comparison to how they would react in the real world. And he calls that real actions in virtual environments, RAVE, right? So one example is what they developed in that European Presentia project was, you have a virtual environment and there's a fire breaking out, and whether people would run out of the virtual room or not, right? So it's a clear indication. If they would not see the fire or experience that as really a fire, and that they are in the room and the fire has something to do with them, then they wouldn't run out of the room, right? So it's an observed behavior of a real world behavior which you replicate in the virtual environment, right? So that's one of it. So we had our own, say again, you know, very lo-fi environment, super lo-fi, even more lo-fi than the other one I showed you. So this is the same story. So you have an environment which has, you know, that kind of a fear of heights provoking environment, and so people have to walk in real space, one-on-one, the same as in the virtual space, and then they're asked to cross that little bridge in that environment and do some tasks. And I observe people crawling on the floor with the head-mount display on. So it's a real, you see the behavior as if they would walk across a bridge and there would be a huge gap and a drop, right? So it works, it really works, right? It really works when you observe users. And it's a little bit more objective. It's during the time, it's not retrospectively, it is not that they have to explain their feelings, it is really, oh, they do it in that moment. They run out, they crawl, they sweat, they shiver, right? So they really do that, right? It's a little bit more complicated than the questionnaire. So what are possible limitations of those kind of real actions in virtual environment of observation? Oh, okay, so it's not the multi-sensory experience, you mean? It's just the visual aspect and not the rest of it, you know, whatever. Do you mean that? Yeah, okay. I don't have that on my slides.
Because they think that's expected.
Okay, so they show a different behavior than they would in the real world because they know it's an experimental condition. Yeah, okay, cool.
Spatial limitation. Is it going to keep it within a certain confined area? Now we have like a whole building.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. With the last study, it was exactly the space, right? It was a walking space. That's why it needed the big construction to, you know, for the you know, leading the wires for the head-mounted display. Yes, but in most cases you would have some teleportation, or you can't really. Yep.
Any case for real things that are real as well.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah. Yep. Yes. Yeah, you have to have a counterpart for it, right? Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay, so these are my points here. There must have what just Stu said, right? There must have a real world equivalent, right? For instance, one extreme example is, you know, Johnny's experiment here, you know, manipulating four-dimensional space. This is not what we normally do in the real world. I mean, so how do you then compare? What is the right behavior, you know, which you would like to observe, right? Second aspect is actually almost always suitable only for lab conditions, for experiments, right? So it's really not suitable. Let's say you want to have a virtual environment which shows you a manufacturing environment to light a fire and just to see whether people are present in it, right? So you have to introduce artificial triggers to measure the behavior if it is not shown naturally anyways, right? And even if so, do people always show observable behavior, right? I might be totally part of that environment, right? But I don't show it. Why would I show it? I mean, I'm just in there, right? It's so there are a couple of flaws. But the main thing is really that it is actually for those unprepared environments, it's unsuitable, and you have to have a real world equivalent for it, right? And if you go into immersive analytics or something like that, often you don't have that. Yeah.
But isn't it also basically how conscious we are to do this action? For example, there's certain actions like our blink reflex. Yeah. We probably it's so low level that we see a reflex, but actually I don't think it really matters for presence because it's just so low level.
That shows something, but
it shows something,
not presence.
Yeah.
Good point. Very good point. Yeah. Okay. Third group, physiological measures, and I just picked 3.5 examples here. So one is where the high-tech example, right? We use functional MRI systems. So we put, and Hunter Hoffman did that here. So you put people into the big tube, into the MRI machine, and then you have a head-mounted display in the MRI machine, which is actually totally made out of plastic and glass, and you have some fiber optic cables, and they feed that head-mounted display because you can't have any metals in the tube, and so on and so forth. And then he measured or he scanned the brain while people were seeing some virtual environment here. So I'm not asking about the limitations of that particular one, but I would have some. And so that's one way. So fMRI probably behind it. The probably a little bit of a milder version of it would be EEG measures, right? So we have, certain, it's called localization. We have certain areas of the brain just under the skull where we can measure, electrical, activity according to certain things, right? Let's say we move our arm, then we can probably measure it somehow that there's some electrical activity, and they did it here in their study. While people were moving through in a virtual environment. So which brain activity is going on during that task, right? And the third one would be we measure galvanic skin response and pulse and heart rate and things like that. So like in that particular study about, stressors in virtual environments. And so you see that, the participants have, at the fingers, they have these, measurement sensors, and then they're fed into the system and measure, GSR and heart rate and so on and so forth, right? And then we have one study that the aforementioned Johnny study, where he combined different measures. It is actually where he combined the pulse and some accelerometer data and some heart rate variability data and analyzed that all. And that was that task where you manipulate, in that case, a 4-dimensional cube in 3-dimensional space, right? So all these measures out there, and the beauty of it is you get all these beautiful data, which you can also visualize and can analyze and can use statistical or other methods to come to some findings. As you could have guessed, this is another question. So what are the potential limitations of those physiological measures?
Just hard to tie them to presence. So you might say, swimming, whatever, what does that mean more in this system?
Very good point, very good point. Could be anything else, could be arousal or fear or sleepiness or whatever. Yep, very good point, yep. Anything else? Oh, okay. Yeah. It might be very distracting. For instance, if you did MRI thing, really the interactive part is not really there, right? You're lying there and staring at a head-mount display, fixed head-mount display. Yeah, so it's very constrained. Yeah. Anything else?
Things you can't measure using things that are for physics.
Yeah, all going into that direction. Actually, it's the weakest of all those forms, right, of measurements, right? So first need for instrumentation, you saw it with the EEG or the MRI to body, or even those GSR sensors, right? So the people have to hold their hands still, they can't really move because otherwise you get too much noise in the data and so on and so forth. But what I put two reallys in here, you really need to know what you are measuring. It's exactly that. I mean, it's like, what are we really measuring here? Is it presence? Is it something else, right? It needs carefully modeling, especially when it comes to fMRI studies. You should have concrete hypotheses. You should have a model about what you expect to see in that scan. Otherwise, you will probably end up with some, and I call it esoteric results. And actually, if you have the spare time, look up that paper about the salmon in the fMRI tube, and that salmon was shown pictures, I think, of happiness and sadness, and then they measured with the fMRI, measured the little brain activity in the salmon, and then they found out that the salmon responded to those pictures, and the best thing about it was that the salmon was dead, and that was all reputable researchers in that field, right? So you really have to know what you are measuring here. You careful modeling and analysis, right? So that's the main thing. Okay, so in the remaining time, I want to talk a little bit about social presence, which is, or the presence of multiple people in one environment, perhaps, and if time allows, a little bit about telepresence and mixed reality presence, right? So social and co-presence. So there's one actually seminal paper about that, and the initial model by Frank Baroka, which says, okay, social presence is that big construct which actually has the different theoretical components: co-presence, psychological involvement, and behavioral engagement. And I just look at co-presence for now, just for the sake of time here. And if we look into co-presence, his group identified actually two factors. So one he calls isolation, and the other one he calls mutual awareness. And so, and I talked to Frank about it. It is a little bit of a muddled construct here, because social presence can mean I feel socially connected to you, Benjamin, but it does not necessarily mean that we are in the same room. We can be on a telephone, or you talk to your mom on the phone, and that you are still socially present. You feel together, but you're not in the same room. And co-presence is actually that we are here. That we are next to each other, right? And so, and what you see here with that construct, and that's why that we did not have too much luck with applying the Bioka measures to measure neither co-presence nor social presence, right? So it's probably because it's one of the early ones to try to measure that kind of construct, right? We had very success with a totally different measure from the mid-70s, which is called semantic differential measure by Short, Williams, and Christie. So they focus more on the medium. So how transparent, how open, how socially friendly is the medium for that kind of interaction or feeling of togetherness, right? And then they did that back in the 70s with different media, from face-to-face communication, no medium involved really, up to, you're writing a letter and then you send it to another person, right? So the question here would be really, where do we sit here with XR? So to really, virtual reality or augmented reality, very interesting questions around that. So it might be even almost as high as face-to-face communication or not. We don't know, it's an open question. And just to give you an example, and it looks a little bit obscure, but I said it works. This is the semantic differential technique. It's a reporting technique, and you have those scales and those polar scales, and you just answer questions like about the openness or the warmth or whatever of that environment. But that gives quite, you use them as well, I think, Noel, and it gives you quite nice measures of social presence. And we are not the only ones, hundreds of groups that have used those measures. So actually it might be something to be considered. So that's about the social presence aspect of it with regard to the medium. And it's often what we are interested in, right? We often have these conditions with different media. And then we have Jeremy Bellinson from Stanford. He looked more into the co-presence, into that, are we next to each other? Are we in the same environment? And he developed also a set of self-report questions, which we applied more successfully than the Frank Bioka ones. And if you combine them with other measures, you come actually to nice co-presence measures if you are interested in that particular question. So, but again, as a take-home message, abbreviated, simplified, so what is actually co-presence? What does it mean? So actually one is, we have the sense of presence, the sense of being there. And we have the sense of being together. And if you bring them both together into one thing, then we have that sense of being there together. And this is really what we're often after, right? And this is the co-presence aspect, right? So we want to be in one virtual environment or mixed environment, and for that matter, we want to be together there. So the togetherness and the being there-ness, right, combined. That's co-presence, okay? So second last, telepresence. So telepresence is the sense of being in another real environment, right? And so I have one example here from our own research. So where you try to capture a remote environment, and then you allow another person who is not in that remote environment to experience that in a remote environment, but in an interactive way. So it is not necessarily that, let's say, another person in Queenstown would have a cell phone and look around, and you are on FaceTime or Skype or whatever, and you see what that person is seeing. Perhaps you might develop a sense of telepresence in that other space, but it really means you capture the other environment, and I independently here can experience that environment as my real environment, right? So that is telepresence. The other aspect is, and here Matt is featured here, is really where we feel co-present in a virtual environment. So that means it's not only about that other environment, it's actually the other person which is elsewhere. How do we meet in one place, right? That's tele-co-presence. So we are co-present in some way. Matt and I meet together either here or there or in some virtual space, right? So it's more about the people interacting with each other. And also some examples here from Noel's work and our own work. And finally, there's a nice mix, and it's a recent paper by TJ's group from Victoria, where he calls it augmented virtual teleportation, where you actually combine different elements of telepresence and teleco-presence. for instance, he depicts, or his group depicts, the people not like we do as, you know, realistic or voxel avatars, but more as virtual reality avatars, but they interact in some real environment which are captured, or 3D video environments or other realistically looking environments, right? But again, here as an abbreviated, simplified version, and then you will see that there are similarities to the co-presence construct. So we have the sense of telepresence, which is the sense of being there in that other remote real environment, and we have the social presence, that's the sense of being together. And if we combine those two, you get the teleco-presence, right? And for instance, that image here from the holoportation paper from Microsoft depicts that somehow, right? Two people meeting in one space and interacting with each other, right? That would be one of those examples, right? So finally, mixed reality presence, and this is really actually this is the big challenge, right? Mixed reality presence. Because when you look at it, and we had one investigation here about, you know, what does it really mean to be in the mixed reality space, and Johnny Collins here did you know, an investigation about in one small example. So you see here a table, a lamp, and a notebook, right? So that the table could be real or virtual, the lamp could be real or virtual, and the notebook could be real or virtual. So now you have all these interactions of these three components with each other, right? So you could have a real lamp which casts a virtual light onto a real table, or you could have a virtual table with a virtual notebook onto it and a real lamp, or a real, and so on and so forth. So what does that mean for the perception and for the interaction with those objects? And even more so, and we didn't answer that question, is what does that mean for presence? What is it actually? Is it the object presence? Is it the coherence? Is it my relationship to the real or the virtual objects, and so on and so forth? When you exercise all those possibilities, you see that there's quite a lot going on. What you all have to investigate are all these arrows here. What does it mean, right? The relationship to the environment, to the objects, and to the subjects or agents in that environment. And so, what is actually mixed reality presence? Right? It's not hard. It's not easy to answer. We did a very early trial actually on that on augmented reality, and so we asked other augmented reality researchers, for instance, Mark Billinghurst and Oliver Bimber and others, to apply certain questions to those augmented reality environments and send us the data back. So from that preliminary study, we identified three main factors for mixed reality presence. So one is again that realness factor, which is more that kind of, is that virtual object virtual or real thing, right? The other one is the spatial presence aspect, right? Am I part of that mixed environment? The third one we call perceptual stress, which is probably more, are there any breaks in presence between those objects or between me and the other subjects, and so on and so forth. So it's more about the disturbing factor, what is not right in that environment, right? So there are lots of papers on it. I'll give you some pointers here on mixed reality presence, and there's a very recent one actually, which looks into that kind of divided attention in presence. But we have now one student, Tan Tran. He's now in Vietnam at the moment, but he is actually investigating mixed reality presence issues, right? So summary. So what should we take from all that? Number one, presence is at the heart of it all, right? This is the main thing. If we talk about virtual environments, we talk about computer-generated, interactive, real-time, three-dimensional environments with the aim to produce that sense of presence, right? And we have to design for it, right? If we want to have it, we have to design for it. Number two, immersion is not presence. They're different things, right? So you should at least remember that. And presence is not presence. Presence can be spatial presence, social presence, co-presence, whatever, right? So you saw that exercise in those slides, right? Measuring presence. So there are many ways of measuring presence. Questionnaires are far from being flawless, but they are the way to go. So to date, there is no other real robust instrument other than questionnaires, but we need more research into these alternative measures, right? So what could they be? Mixed reality presence, the concept and the measures need to really be researched. There's a lot to do. And finally, I would say, don't forget reality, right? Reality as such, I mean, the real reality, right, is quite a concept, right, when you think of it. And I, in my career, learned a lot about reality by studying virtual reality, also from a philosophical point of view. And this brings the whole thing to a close. And I thank you very much for your kind attention and for answering the questions. Thank you.